Classification is a form of supervised machine learning in which we train a model to determine the categorization, or class, of some item of interest. So what does that actually mean? Well, it helps to think of machine learning models as mathematical functions. A function that operates on an input value, which we'll call x, and calculates an output value, which we'll call y. In machine learning terminology, x represents the features of the item that we're interested in. These are characteristics of the item, usually numeric values. And the y represents a label, the thing that we want to predict. And in this case, that's the class of the object. Okay, well that all seems a bit abstract. So let's look at what's probably the quintessential example of classification, the hello world of machine learning. In 1936, British statistician Ronald Fisher introduced a paper in which he described how to determine the species of an iris flower based on the measurements of its sepals and petals. In this scenario, the features, our x value, is a vector containing the height and width of the sepals and petals for the observed plants. Here's an example. And the label, the y value we're trying to predict, is the species of iris, of which there are three possible values: setosa, versicolor, and virginica. We'll assign the values 0, 1, and 2 to these classes. The y value generated by the function is a vector of probabilities, one for each of the possible classes. So in this example, the function predicts a 0% probability of the first and third classes, which are labelled 0 and 2, and a 100% probability for the second class, which we labelled 1. So in this particular example, this flower is an example of a versicolor. So how do we define the function that calculates this probability vector? Well, we start with some historical observations of data, where we already know the correct label values. In this case, iris measurements where we know the species. This dataset gives us some ground truth with which we can train a function. Now we take some, but not all of our data, and apply an algorithm such as logistic regression, which calculates coefficients that we can use to map the observation vectors into multidimensional space within which there are boundaries or thresholds that separate the different classes. Then we take the data that we held back and we use it to validate the model we've trained by applying the function to it. Now ideally, it should assign each observation to the right class. We can then tabulate the results from our validation data into a structure called a confusion matrix, which counts the predictions, intersecting the predicted classes with the actual known classes. In an ideal model, there should be a high number of cases where the predicted class matches the actual class, which shows up as a diagonal trend in the confusion matrix.